The first snowfall of the season glazed the cul-de-sac in a perfect white hush, each suburban home glowing with meticulous displays of twinkling lights and plastic reindeer. Sarah, staring out her frost-covered bedroom window, watched her son Daniel finish his snowman in the front yard. Daniel was 8, skinny, with a mop of auburn hair that refused to stay combed, and his laughter echoed faintly through the double panes. The snowman was oddly shaped, its torso slightly slumped and its head tilted, as though listening to a whispered secret. Daniel had given it coal eyes, a lopsided grin, and a carrot nose, like in the old songs. But there was something subtly off about its posture, something almost human. Sarah shivered, though the heater rattled warmly behind her, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she pulled the curtains closed before Daniel started waving at her. That night, after the candles in the windows dimmed and the neighborhood fell into its typical winter slumber, Sarah awoke to what sounded like footsteps crunching across snow. Her room was muzzled by thick curtains and walls, but the noise was distinct and deliberate, moving slowly past her house. She froze in bed, ears straining, but the sound ceased entirely, leaving her in a suffocating silence. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind scattering ice across the driveway or a stray animal, but her throat tightened when she remembered. It had snowed all day, tirelessly, covering the streets in fresh, untrodden powder. No one should be walking. Her thoughts flicked to Daniel, fast asleep down the hall, and the image of his crooked snowman resurfaced and lingered unwanted in her mind. The next morning, the snowman had moved. It was impossible, absurd, but as Sarah and Daniel stepped out of the house, she noticed it had shifted several feet closer to the porch. Its coal eyes seemed sharper somehow, less coal and more like something painted in their vacant blackness. Daniel giggled and said that maybe the snowman had wanted to be closer to them. Sarah didn't respond, her heart pattering uncomfortably in her chest. She studied it, keenly aware of a burst of vertigo as she stared into its uneven grin. By late afternoon, it had moved again, this time positioned unnervingly close to the base of the house steps. The footprints, which shouldn't exist, leading to and from the snowman, were bizarrely precise, almost measured, but melted as soon as Sarah tried to track them beyond the yard. Come evening, she found herself locking every door and window with trembling hands, her disbelief clashing with her undeniable fear. Yet when Daniel refused to stop talking about how much he liked the snowman, she didn't have the courage to throw it out. On Christmas Eve, Sarah's neighborhood was awash in muted cheer, distant laughter bubbling from each glowing house. She sat in the living room pretending to read, but her mind reeled around one singular fact. The snowman wasn't outside. She hadn't seen Daniel for an hour, though she'd called his name until her voice cracked. The TV blinked softly in the background, broadcasting a saccharine Christmas special, and the twinkling tree lights created long, uneven shadows across the room. They trembled suddenly as something outside darkened the window. It wasn't approaching snow or an errant cloud. Something much taller hovered just beyond the glass. She bolted for the door to call her son's name, but her voice faltered in her throat. There, leaning awkwardly at the threshold, was the snowman, or the haunting impression of where it had been. Its carrot nose dangled limply from its melted, pale frame, which now stretched impossibly tall. Daniel's ragged scarf was draped around what could only be described as shoulders. Coal mouth, still grinning, loomed wide as a shape shifted behind it, like a human figure with eyes no longer hollow, but hungry.